Welcome back to Soundside. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone, in for Libby Denkman. New year, new you? No, new year, new laws. That's what I always say, at least in Washington state, because from new transportation fees to requirements for closed captions in movie theaters, you might have already noticed the effects of several new laws and taxes with a January 1 start date. And we are about to begin a new legislative session where legislators will pass a bunch of new laws to take effect in the future. So that legislative session will start on Monday, January 12th. In Olympia, lawmakers are facing a yawning budget shortfall that they will need to deal with. So to walk us through what new laws we need to follow and preview the upcoming session for the first time in 2026, Washington State Standard reporter Jake Goldstein-Street. Welcome back to Soundside.
Thanks, Scott.
So in 2025, the state had this large operating budget shortfall, right? Billions of dollars. Your reporting cites some estimates as high as $16 billion over 4 years. As part of the strategy to raise revenue, lawmakers raised taxes on large businesses. There's new business and occupation tax on bigger companies. They also raised the cap on taxing large tech companies. Walk us through what's new with these taxes.
Yeah, so just like you mentioned there, Scott, the big centerpiece of the revenue package that Democratic lawmakers passed and that Governor Ferguson signed are taxes on companies. And one of those is a additional, as you said, B&O tax on bigger companies, those with over $250 million in income. It's a 0.5% tax on income over that threshold. It'll only last a few years, but even that small percentage is expected to raise $550 million a year for the state. And that helps avoid more cuts to the budget last year. Facing that shortfall, they cut about $8 billion in spending and then raised about $8 billion in new taxes. Another one, like you mentioned, is that tax on large tech companies. This is what we call the advanced computing surcharge. This is your huge tech companies, over $25 billion in worldwide revenue. It's somewhat complicated, but until January 1st of this year, that tax only was limited to $9 million per year that those companies would pay. And it was just over 1% was the rate. This year, they're raising that all the way up to 7.5%. And the cap of what those companies can pay in a year is up to $75 million. This largely goes toward higher education programs, workforce investment. And that's another almost $400 million a year. And that's going to rise each year, basically with inflation. Lawmakers had considered uncapping entirely to bring in a lot more money, but they couldn't get that over the finish line this year. There is another aspect of the tax package that went into effect on January 1st that we could talk about, that's dealing with tax preferences. These tax breaks were a small part of it. One of them that was probably the most notable was a tax preference for precious metals. That means likely that, coins and gold sales, those prices are going to go up. And we've already got proposals even before the session starts, like you said, on Monday, that are looking to dial that back, bring that tax exemption back into law. So that one was a bit controversial.
Yeah. Because I wanted to ask you about, there's a new nicotine tax, too, an increase in the cost of plastic bags. The gas tax went up 6 cents a gallon last July. But there's also a bunch of other new transportation fees enacted this year. What do those tax and what are they meant to fund?
Sure. That's a good question, Scott. And so the state has three budgets. The taxes that we were just talking about, those fuel the operating budget. That's your day-to-day services, your core operations. Most of state funding is there. They have a separate budget for transportation projects, and that had a similar shortfall, obviously smaller, and that was dealing with the gas tax revenue is falling as there's more electrification in cars, and cars just get better gas mileage. And meanwhile, as has been covered a lot, construction costs for especially our highway mega projects are really rising quite fast. And so the biggest piece of being able to fill that gap in the transportation budget was, as you mentioned, that gas tax increase, the first one in years that took effect back in July, and it will continue to rise each year. But then a slew of other smaller taxes and fees are going to be going up or are new entirely. They include vehicle weight fees, rental car taxes, just the sales tax on vehicles, a new levy on luxury vehicles, registration and filing fees, all of these different things. And these are all aiming to fuel transportation projects, thinking about our ferries, our roads, highways, that road work you're seeing on I-5, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I wanted to give you a chance to. I mean, you just listed off so many. There's probably more that we don't get time to mention, but I did, before we pivot to this year, I did want to ask, reporter's choice. Tell us about one or more of these new laws or taxes that you want to mention before we move on that just took effect.
Sure. So that's really generous of you, Scott. So one of the
Thank you.
most controversial laws that went in that was very partisan last year was over unemployment benefits for workers that are on strike from their job.
I was hoping you mentioned this one. Yeah.
I'm happy to oblige. So there was a lot of negotiating over this, a lot of hand wringing. What lawmakers eventually settled on, and this is Washington's only the third state, I believe, to put this into law, would give workers who are on strike up to 6 weeks of unemployment benefits. Usually these benefits are available if you're just laid off or you lose your job for up to 26 weeks. That was essential to the negotiations, was landing on that 6-week number. It also extends to employees who are off the job because of a lockout initiated by their employer. This isn't something where if you go on strike for a day that you're going to be getting these. You need to be on strike for 2 to 3 weeks to even start getting these unemployment benefits. If it doesn't last that long, you won't get them. And if your strike ends up being ruled that it was illegal under state or federal law, you'll have to give the benefits back. So there are a number of caveats to this. I mean, a lot of businesses are worried that this is going to incentivize strikes. And this is something that will only be on the books, at least as it's currently written, until the end of 2035. The one to think about was the machinist strike at Boeing in 2024. That, those were tens of thousands of workers on strike for almost 2 months, I believe. And so that this is something that you could see coming into play in a strike like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I want to pivot. Laws taking effect now were passed in last year's session. So this year, when lawmakers will meet to pass a bunch of new laws, before I do that, actually, I want to mention a big surprise from the governor at the end of 2025 that has to do with this session, obviously. Governor Bob Ferguson came out and said, to fix our regressive tax structure where poorer people pay more of their income in taxes, let's tax millionaires and let's do it in the next 60 days or 60 days starting Monday. But Governor Ferguson said that is not going to help our budget situation now, and it might get challenged in court and go to the ballot. So it might not help us until 2029. What strategies to fill the shortfall in the short term will have the most momentum in Olympia this year, according to you?
Sure. So, yeah, that's exactly right. The governor, when rolling out his proposal for the operating budget right before Christmas, he twinned that, which was a all cuts budget proposal, and it's just a proposal. It'll go before lawmakers, and they'll get the final say before sending it to the governor for his signature in March. He had, in this supplemental budget, which is just for the next fiscal year, cutting several things. And I think the biggest maneuver in his budget to try to save money was using dollars from the Climate Commitment Act. These are those carbon auctions that have raised a lot of money for the state, largely for climate programs. But one use of that money that's laid out explicitly in the law, the Climate Commitment Act originally, was using it for the working families tax credit, which is not a climate program. But for the first time, he wants to use this money for that. And that's, around $500 million that could be saved without having to be cut.
Yeah, so basically moving money for climate change into the working families tax credit program to fill that gap there.
Yes, exactly. And this is the idea that, is rankling
Yeah.
environmentalists. They don't want to see that money going away from environmental programs. But it is something that is allowed in the law, and it'll be an interesting debate on that throughout the session.
Yeah. Another thing that happened at the end of last year, obviously, was historic flooding across Western Washington. And we still don't know how much money, or if any, we're going to get from the federal government to aid people, to aid recovery efforts on the state level. Trump has slow walked or denied our asks for aid in the past, last year and during his first term. How are state legislators going to budget if they don't know how much aid is coming from the federal government? You were talking about, the transportation budget. Like, how is that even going to work if we need to rebuild roads like US 2, which I know is a federal highway, but other state roads that were getting, affected? How are they going to budget if they don't know how much help is coming from the federal government? That seems like a really tough equation to do.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the big questions looming over the budget talks
Mm,
this year in Olympia. It's something where this is the damage, the assessments are still coming in from counties, local governments, from individuals who
yeah,
are affected by this. I mean, this is tens of millions of dollars easily that we're talking about here in damage. And that, given the state's budget situation, the shortfall that we've been talking about here, that the state does not have room to fill. And so is really reliant here on the federal government to get that money. I think, one issue, it might just be time. Last year,
mm,
you were talking about the bomb cyclone
yeah,
request, very similar to this. That was in fall 2024. The state requested a disaster declaration to open up funding to respond to that. It wasn't until, I think, the spring,
yeah,
I think
that's right.
April, that the president denied it. And so lawmakers could be leaving Olympia in after a 60-day session in mid-March without knowing how the president is going to decide in this. There is a lot of attention. There might be pressure on the president to be deciding this sooner now with this experience of last year with the bomb cyclone. It's just a huge question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it being the week before the session, a lot of, especially Democrats, are releasing proposals and saying, let's pass this, let's pass this. Usually they do not tell me, at least, that their proposals are for sure not going to pass. But I was speaking to Democratic Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon about a resolution that he said won't even come up for a vote. And this has to do with national politics as well. And I want to ask you about it. It's a resolution to put a vote to the people and change the state constitution to allow Democrats to redraw congressional districts in their favor to respond to President Trump, asking Texas and a bunch of other red states to redraw their congressional districts so Republicans can keep the House this fall. It won't come up for a vote, most likely, because Democrats would need a 2/3 majority in both chambers. So several Republicans would have to sign on. Rep. Fitzgibbon said, this is just to start a conversation. What if Democrats had 2/3 control of both chambers? What if they won it this fall in the 2026 midterms? This is one thing they could do. Does that argument hold water to you? Are Democrats anywhere close to dreaming of 2/3 of the House or Senate this fall in the midterms?
Well, I think if we look at, the early, election results across the country, there is a lot of momentum,
Mm,
even, in these one-off elections for Democrats so far. And so I think they want to make it clear that it's on the table and that a lot of Democrats in Washington state feel somewhat powerless to fight against what's going on in the other Washington. And if this was eventually going to go to the ballot, this would be kind of one way that they could kind of secure an easier way to rebuke the president. Basically,
yeah,
they could get another seat in Congress
yeah,
for the Democrats. This was an interesting proposal and somewhat surprising, given that Democrats here in Washington were, saying that there really wasn't space to gerrymander another
yeah,
Democratic district. It's right now 8-2. That all of central and eastern Washington, for the most part, is led by Republicans. There's not a ton of space to gerrymander another district for Democrats, and so to bring this back up signals that they at least want the conversation to be on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we let you go, we've gone broad, so let's stay broad. What are the biggest questions you have about Washington state politics this year? The legislative session, anything else? The governor?
It's an interesting session, Scott. Everything, all the discussions that reporters, I would say, have been having, and I can only speak for myself, but I would assume it's the rest of us down here, is the budget. I mean, that's the biggest question. And then this question of, will progressives finally get this income tax that you mentioned momentarily on millionaires? Will they be able to get that? Will that withstand, presumed legal challenges? It'll take a few years to even go into effect, but that is kind of the big debate. There's still a lot of question marks, I think, about what the big policy debates of this session were. Last year, we had a few around housing, around those unemployment benefits, around parental rights for students. And then I think the one other thing that we haven't mentioned that's also looming are these two initiatives to the legislature from hedge fund manager conservative Brian Haywood around parental rights, like I said, and allowing transgender students in sports. And so those are kind of two things that I would assume are not going to get a hearing from a Democratic-controlled legislature, and then we'll go to the people. But those are two things that, there's going to be a lot of question marks about that during the session here in Olympia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, going back to, Representative Fitzgibbon, the Democratic majority leader, he's thinking about this fall. He's thinking about 2026 general election. I assume he's also thinking about it because voters are going to have to decide if they want to pass these conservative-backed initiatives around parental rights that would give parents rights to access things like mental health counseling records of their teens, and also, require all participants in girls' school sports to prove with a doctor's note or a primary care physician's note that they have female biological anatomy. And those are big questions. Those are big political questions. Those are questions that Republicans are absolutely trying to prop up right now as their kind of their economic and healthcare and many other platforms that they have are really hitting some real pushback from voters who feel that prices are still high and healthcare prices are even going up. It's gonna be a really big year in the state legislature and at the ballot. So thanks for coming in and talking with us. And we will definitely have you back on many more times. Jake Goldstein-Street of the Washington State Standard. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Always good talking with you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.